What is native yeast? I'm sure you might be familiar with yeast, right? It's an amazing organism that, on a very basic level, converts sugar into alcohol, and without it, we wouldn't have wine. So what is native yeast? Well, native yeast are yeasts that exist indigenously here on this site. You may be familiar with terroir, which is a term we use to describe, wines and how they are unique to the region in which they are grown, depending on soil, climate, aspects of the vineyard. But another part, we assert here at Hardrow is that the yeasts that exist here naturally are also part of that terroir, because the yeasts here are going to be different than the yeast down in Oregon or over in France or even in New Zealand. And we use these to make very terroir-driven wines, which is something we think is very important. We do a lot of single vineyard, single varietal, and the yeasts that occur here in these vineyards are very important to making those wines unique. So what yeast does is it converts sugar to alcohol, and without it, we wouldn't have wine, right? And so what a sad world that would be without yeast. So let's take a moment to say thank you to yeast, and let's talk about why the yeast here in this vineyard helps us make truly unique wines that couldn't exist anywhere else. If you've ever had wines at Hardrow, you may have noticed or heard us talk about native yeast or indigenous yeast, and we use these mainly in our estate varieties, right? So our estate Cab Franc, our estate Syrah, because we're really trying to elevate that terroir, what makes the wines that are grown here on our estate vineyards different than the ones in Oregon or France or New Zealand, wherever it may be. But we also use conventional yeast. These are yeasts that have been cultured in a lab, isolated from somewhere, generally in France, and then bred over generations to have different characteristics, right? A lot of them are more tolerant to higher levels of alcohol. They're more tolerant to certain preservatives we might use in winemaking. They could be more tolerant to low temperatures, or they can be more sensitive to low temperatures depending on the application. So conventional yeast are great if you have a very specific thing that you're looking for and you want the yeast to perform in a very specific way. This can be a great tool for winemakers because they're very consistent. And so we use these, when we're trying to get a specific result and we're less concerned about, terroir. But when we're dealing with our estate wines, where we're really trying to highlight the differences between the wines grown here in other parts of Washington or other parts of the world, the indigenous yeast are really the best tool for that, because the yeast that's here is going to be different than any other place in the world. Native yeast is actually, one of the oldest techniques in winemaking, right? We didn't have commercial yeast until around the 1980s, and before you could hop online or talk to a salesperson and buy whatever specific yeast you wanted, you would have to rely on the yeast that happened to be around. But once we found commercial yeast, I feel like we kind of lost sight of that, because now you're able to buy exactly what you want and get these very specific yeasts that are isolated from Bordeaux if you're making a Bordeaux variety, or the Rhone Valley if you're making, say, a Rhone. But now we're coming kind of full circle and realizing, do we really want yeast that's from France, or do we want the yeast from here in the Chelan Valley facilitating our fermentation for our Lake Chelan Syrah? And I would say yes, of course. Anything we can do to make it more of our own, to highlight the unique beauty and unique conditions in which these grapes are grown, is really important when we are talking about winemaking. You might be asking, why don't we see more native fermentation? Well, native fermentation presents a series of problems that just don't really exist with conventional winemaking or conventional yeast. One of the biggest ones is the lag time. When we process fruit, whether we're pressing grapes for white wine or destemming them to make a red wine, where we have to wait for the indigenous yeast populations to grow and for fermentation to start. Wine is very vulnerable in this state because it's not wine yet, it's essentially grape juice. We're worried about, bacteria or yeast that we don't like, such as Brettanomyces. If you've ever had a wine that maybe tasted like kind of barnyardy or medicinal, like Band-Aids, that's from a different type of yeast called Brett. So we want to avoid those while we wait for the yeast that we like to start fermentation. We use a few different methods. One of the biggest ways to mitigate this is denying oxygen. And aside from just waiting for the yeast to start fermentation and get that rolling, we are also worried about certain conditions that the yeast might not tolerate. We don't know what to expect from the native yeast strains, right? Some of them might tolerate a higher alcohol, but others might not. Or temperature. If the temperature gets too hot, the yeast might stress, or fermentation might halt if temperature is too low. When you use conventional yeast, this is all highlighted. The labs that culture and breed these yeasts do a lot of research into how they behave, and will let you know, like, say, what the highest tolerated temperature is, what the lowest tolerated temperature is, how high the alcohol can be before the yeast starts to halt. And we don't typically know this in native fermentation, so it requires someone to be constantly watching this fermentation to see what types of behavior is happening and adjusting that in real time in kind of a more dynamic situation. There you have it. There's our take on native fermentation, why we think it's so important, especially when delivering these beautiful wines we grow here in Lake Chelan, and really trying to make something special and unique to this valley. If you're in Central Washington, or next time you're in the beautiful Chelan Valley, come and see us. I'd love to talk to you more about native yeast. This is really only the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more to discuss. There's a lot of techniques that we are using and developing to try and make wine using native yeast better and more efficient, all part of the wonderful process of winemaking. Thanks so much for watching. And if you like this type of content, please subscribe, leave us a comment. I love engaging, whether you come into the winery personally or you send us a message on YouTube. I'd love to talk to y'all. So anyways, thanks again.